Hello, my name is Carissa Alva, and I will be discussing public and private histories through the poem Personal Effects by Salma Sharif. So, a brief history on public and private histories. To quote Mohammed Patel, history is not just a record of the past, it is a guide to understanding our present and shaping our future. Now, the history of history generally is known as what happened and is told through the perspective of the winners. This history is regarded as a truth that paved the path from the past to the present. And knowing this matters because it's the propaganda we are fed. And the histories of the people who lived throughout history, who are generally considered the losers, the victims, are lost in the shadows. And there are many more of those stories than the narrative that's told through history books. Historical representation. So, generally, at least in American fiction, United States of American fiction, and see, I called it fiction, but it's actually passed off as fact. It's the perspective, selection, ordering, and presentation of events as generally displayed and determined by old white men, like these guys who signed our Constitution. If you take the people that this was made for, who it ignored the wives of these people, the people who weren't wives of these people, anybody that was alive during this time and may have been affected adversely, inadvertently, or just walked by the window hearing it, has their own story. It's who's perceiving it, what part of it they're talking about, which order, if it's a reflection or if it's happening now. And then the way that's all presented is what makes creative writing such a powerful form of telling the private histories to the public, which rewrites the public histories that were so commonly told. Public history is told in textbooks with the milestones in our time, and it shapes the story we tell about our culture. Private history is about moments in time, relationships, grief, and it shapes the story of our lives. Boom. So for Personal Effects by Salma Sharif, this is just the first stanza in a very long poem. I place a photograph of my uncle on my computer desktop, which means I learn to ignore it. He stands by a tank, helmet tilting to his right, bootlaces tightened as if stitching together a wound. Alive, the hand brings up a cigarette we won't see him taste. Last night, I smoked one of the steps outside my barn apartment. I promised I broke myself. He promised himself he wouldn't, and did. I smell my fingers, and I am smelling his. Hands of smoke and gunpowder. Hands that promised they wouldn't, but did. Now, Personal Effects, as I mentioned, is a multi-layered poem that's told in many different forms, from prose to verse, and it has historically laced paragraphs with personal emotional devastation. And it has tercets and longer free verse that physically move on different sides of the page. This is just the first one. It kind of shows how the way this ordering of events that was mentioned here, the perspective, whoop, whoop, selection, ordering, and presentation, depending on who's telling it and the way it's told, can shift our perspective on what's happening. Now, the history of history, again. Salma Sharif is an Iranian-American poet born in Istanbul, Turkey. She earned her degrees and worked at Berkeley University. She's published 2 books and has won many prestigious awards. This is a very brief synopsis. Now, the poem is about her coming to terms with the death of her uncle Amu, who fought in the 1980s war between Iran and Iraq. He was just one of hundreds of thousands of people who died in this war, a war that maybe the general public or people with general education don't even know about. I don't know much about it, to be honest. And the fact that hundreds of thousands of people that died meant that millions of people were affected. These are the private histories that we're not told about. Going back to this, when I wrote the poem, I was looking at the way she's telling the story. The term personal effects refers to a person's personal property, usually items of particular significance that are carried or won. It starts with a photograph of an album, the thoughts in the mind as the photo was taken, the tragic events surrounding that moment, the photo as a token, the photo held in memoriam, the photo holds a private history. A bridge connecting two faces, one who wonders while the one other silently endures the hidden details of a tragic war. A war whose violence knows no bounds, whose soldiers' detachment from the only home they've ever known is bound by duty and greeted with death. Death to be remembered through personal effects, symbolizing movements that honor the nation but exploit the victims, the soldiers, the warriors, the children plucked from their lives until only the tokens, these personal effects, create the personal effect on those that were not there. Lost history is telling a story to someone whose history had nothing to do with the war at all, until they go looking for answers, looking for solace, looking for some semblance of humanity in a history that has told them only history matters. Boop. This micro review by David Baker says, of course, as with all language, all points of views, the objective is as impossible as the complete or even the sufficient. As she proceeds, the poet, she comes to realize the fundamental irony of her work. Each photo is an absence. Personal effects is the accrual of pieces, inscriptions concurrent with, sometimes overtaken by erasures. So whose history is it? There are no winners, only stories. And it's not just the public history that matters, but the private lives that were affected by it. So when we think of 9/11, for example, you think of America getting screwed over and our vengeance towards it. But how about all those lives that were claimed? Or how about the life of Gerard Way, who witnessed it and then created the band My Chemical Romance? And all the stories and lives that affected. This is how we look at something like the private and public histories, right? The trails that stem out from these big trees rooted in our culture. Effin.